And we're live. Okay, so continuing off from where we left off in the previous session, where we edited, amended and updated the character's skeleton, which for imvu furniture items is, let me just invert this, hide. So that's our modified character skeleton, which was modified from 26, which was modified, invert hide, which was modified from that. So that was the original skeleton that we, well, it's not the original, that was a modified skeleton, or a modified version of the original skeleton, which was just 2 bones, because we wanted very simple control over the mesh. So we added a foot bone that corresponds, corresponded to, let me just move this out of the way, corresponded to the character's feet, so that we could create a very simple hop animation that meant that when it was moving, the feet were always parallel to the ground plane. So with those 2 bones, we created a very simple hop animation. And this looks like it's using the, yes it is. So we were part way through the modification of the mesh as shown here. So if I go back even further, so that's 26, 24. Select the armature to reveal the sequence. So we have 2 sequences going on at the moment. So we've got the bob, short for Kate, of the character, which is controlled by the armature, and then there is a control node which controls the forward or backward, left, right, whatever it is, the motion of the character. So we modified this because we wanted more complicated, or well, yes, more complicated animation. So what we did was previously added the toe bone, and then we adjusted that so that we have 28, so that we now have a much more complete skeleton. So invert that and hide those for the moment. Whoops. So we have a much more complete skeleton. But in doing this, we had to sort out a couple of things. Hang on, Frenzy, I'll answer your question in a second. So we had to sort out a couple of things where we, in adjusting the armature, because we renamed the bones, Blender will automatically rename any vertex groups that are associated with any meshes. So we have to clean up the associations that we create there. And basically means that we rename vertex groups and reassign them depending on which part of the mesh is then incorrectly animated as a bone moves. So we sorted that out, and then we positioned the bones, the new bones, relative to the elements that we want to control. So overall, we've essentially fixed that problem in the sense that we've added more bones, made the armature a bit more complicated so that we can do much more detailed, for want of a better word, detailed animations. But in doing all of that, we've essentially broken isn't the right word, but we've broken the previous animation that we had assigned. So we've got a couple of issues. There's a gap here between these two bones, which likely means that there isn't an associate. These two bones aren't linked together, because when the torso bone moves, which is the control bone for everything, it should move the legs and the feet, but it doesn't. So that means we need to check the relationships between all the bones to make sure that they're all okay. And then one of the other things that we can do is rename the armature. So switch out of that. That's pose mode. So let's do that first, renaming the armature. So it is selected. Object properties, object data properties, and just rename the skeleton. Turkey.rig. The .rig bit is optional. It just helps you immediately identify, because you could have the mesh called Turkey, the rig called Turkey, and then there could be several other objects, and that will allow you to just immediately see which one is the mesh. So that's called turkey.mesh, and the rig is called turkey.rig. But for the root node, that needs to be called root. That is always called root. So checking our relationships again, root controls, root should control everything. So we might need to double check our parenting, because we unparented everything previously. So what should happen is when we move the root node, everything else should move. When we move the Turkey mesh root control, which controls the forward motion, the Turkey should move with the skeleton. So because we unparented that in the previous session, we need to re-establish all those relationships, but we can do that later. So we've renamed the skeleton, so just right click, object data, object properties, just rename it. Rename the mesh, that's turkey.mesh, turkey.rig. You can call the control node that controls the character anything you want, but root needs to be called root, which is this large box. Right, so what we could probably do is fix. Oh, we need to check the relationship between the bones. So right click, select the armature, edit mode. Actually, let's just, so I'm just going to hide the other objects. So that's, with the armature selected, you can use Control I for indigo, I for indigo, Control I. That inverts the selection, which selects everything except the thing that you were selecting, and then just press the H key to hide. So that's a skeleton. So we need to check, just to make this easier to see. Right, there we go. Right, so we've got our relationship lines. That's this faint line that we can see. So when bones are linked, they have that line. So when we moved the torso bone, the legs didn't move, and that's because there is no link between those two bones, between these two. So if that's moved, the foot works, but nothing happens to the torso. So right click the bone, object data properties or bone properties, go down to the relations section, And here we can see that parent is blank. So click the bone icon and select torso from the list. And then, I don't know if that'll come through on the video, but a small or a thin relationship line has now appeared. So that means that when torso is moved in pose mode, it should move. It should now move everything else, which it now does. Right, so we need to double check the bones. So that moves. That's got its relationship sorted out. That's connected to those. That's connected. The one behind, that's connected. The head, that's connected. And the tail, that's connected. Okay. Right, so check the checklist. So we've checked the bones relationship. We've renamed the armature. So now what we need to do is parent everything together, or at least parent the mesh. So unhide everything. So we need to parent the mesh to the armature. So right click the mesh and then shift right click the armature and then Control P, or from the object menu, where's parent gone? Parent, object, keep transform, or armature deform. So this will now mean that in pose mode, so either switch using the selector or Control Tab with the armature selected, and that should now mean that the bones control the mesh. So double check everything. Right, excellent. So save the file. 29. And then we can start amending, updating the animation. So previously it was set up just so that it hopped. But we've got some leftover, or not leftover, but some of the leftover animation positions and rotations and whatnot. Now that they're associated with completely different sections of the mesh, we've got bits moving that shouldn't be moving. And we have bits that should be moving, not moving. So we need to make some adjustments to that. So what we can do here is now this is where it becomes not time consuming, but this is it's quite iterative, repetitive. So selecting the tailbone, that moves along its local axis, which is relative to the green handle of the widget. We want to prevent that, so we need to reset that bone so that it doesn't move. So at frame 20, let me expand that a bit. At frame 20, we need to reset it. So make sure it's selected, and then either pose, clear transform all, or you can use any one of these, but the shortcut keys, that's Alt G and it resets. Alt-R resets the rotation, and Alt-S, which we don't necessarily use, which is scale. And we've got auto insert enabled. So we click the red button, set the keys, set it to keyframe, and then select the type of information that we want, which is lock rot. And that will automatically insert the keyframe every time a bone is moved. So we'll clear it from that frame and just go through the main keyframes. So Alt-G, and make sure Alt-R, it's clear. Alt-G, Alt-R. And what this is essentially doing, Alt-G, Alt-R, it's overriding the keyframes that already exist. Alt-G, Alt-R. So now that doesn't move. Right, so first thing to do then is to fix the hop. So at it should be right. So at frame 20, there should be some compression. So we want to select this bone, torso bone, and drop this down. And of course, the legs and the feet have gone below the horizon or the ground plane. So we want to select the leg bone and move that up so that the bottom of the feet is parallel with the ground plane. And again, auto insert occurs. Now, because we added extra bones, because this is the first keyframe of this new setup, we've got an extra keyframe here, but we don't have keyframes at the front or behind. So that basically means the bone will keep its position from this frame. So we have to reset that. So that's move the timeline scrubber to the frame that you want to clear. So this is frame 1. And then again, Alt-G to reset, and it pops in a keyframe for us. And then do the same at the next keyframe, regardless as to what the bones are actually doing. Just reset. And this just makes sure that there is no positional data associated with those frames. So that's Alt-G and Alt-R. Alt-G, Alt-R. Just double check. Alt-G, Alt-R. Now we don't want to do Alt-G on that because it'll reset. So we've got the character dropping down before it springs up. And then we need another drop down at frame 70. So again, select the torso bone, drop the whole thing down, select the leg bone and move that up so that the feet are parallel with the ground. So what we now have is a bit of a drops its weight, springs up, and then springs back down as it lands. So that can be the adjusted version of the original animation that we did. But as we have all these new bones, we might as well start using them. So what we want is for there to be a bit more realism, in the sense that you can imagine that this being metal it's heavy. Lots of heavy parts. So what we can do is, with these new bones, is we can add, there are technical words for these aspects of the animation process, but you can just consider them secondary motions if you like. So the character just bouncing, moving up, that would be a primary motion. The fact that his feet tilt, that you could consider a secondary motion, because it's not specifically, you could get away with the bounce without the feet tilting like that. So if I clear that, it wouldn't look quite as good, but that's your primary action, is just it bouncing up and down without anything happening. But what we can do is add these secondary elements, or these secondary positions, to the overall animation to give it a bit more realism. I mean, it's not that a robot turkey is real, but realism in terms of what you might expect it to do. So what we might do here is, so it bounces down. So let's say it twists its body upwards slightly. So we can twist the body, which obviously means we have to compensate and straighten the legs. And you can do this arbitrary, or if you hold down the control key after you've initiated rotate, you'll snap to increments, which makes it easier to make adjustments to other elements that might need adjusting. So what we've now got is it bouncing down and then jumping up and tilting its body as it moves up. And then what we can also do at the height, we need to make an adjustment here. So that's the top of the sequence. So what we can do, so let me think. Right, so body tilts back. What we might also want to do is tilt the head. So tilt the head forward. That's created a new keyframe that's not been done before, so we have to go back through the reset process again. And this time we just need to do Alt-R, because all we've done is rotate. Alt-R. And then at this frame, where it's at the bottom of its bounce, we can rotate that down. Then clear that in the next frame. So you can see how these minor adjustments start to make the character look a bit more alive. So here's tail probably wants to be upwards. Or no, hang on. No. Needs to go down. So momentum, tail would be down a few degrees. It's going down, up. And that's the top of the jump. So the tail goes up. It stays up until it bounces down before returning back to its default position. So with a few minor adjustments and fiddling around, you get something that starts to look more interesting than just a simple up and down. And unfortunately, you often get these little idiosyncrasies where the bone, because of the tweening, the in-between, because of the interpolation or interpolation between two keyframes, because it's guessing the position of the bone, what will sometimes happen is that the position of the bone will alter in a way that you don't want it to as it passes between the two frames. So when that happens, you have to add extra bone tweaks, and these are often very small incremental changes. So we have to adjust the feet bone and the leg bone here slightly to raise that up, to keep the feet on the ground. And then of course we can just drop the wings It's not going to flap them. So the wings should go down. And again, we've created two more keyframes. So we have to reset those, or reset those at other positions, other frames. So that we have some raw data, raw positional data that we can work with. So that's the top. So we want to move the wings up. And then down before it springs back up to its default position. Whoops. So if you accidentally position a pose or keyframe in the wrong place, just right click, shift right click, press the G key, and you can move them along the timeline. Just left click to set in place and confirm. And you should always, unlike other applications, you should always start your sequence at frame 1, not 0. There is a reason for it, but I don't recall what it is off the top of my head. So what we end up with is a much more interesting and alive animation. So save the file, save as 30. Okay. So that's we can use sequences that have been previously created, but it often means that you have to clean them up. You also have to be aware that if you do that and a bone or something is drastically repositioned relative to what it was doing before, there can be some issues with the essentially the positional data of the bone. It doesn't break or get corrupted, but it keeps the data that was associated with this old position. So when it's played back, it might look okay in Blender, but when it's played back in imvu or whatever it is that the character is for, it reverts back to, or it uses the data that it finds in the file. So if that old information is still there, it'll make the character or the mesh do things that you weren't expecting. So even though it looks okay in Blender, be aware of that. So what we can do now then, now that we've got an adjusted animation, so we parented the mesh to the armature. We want to parent the armature to the control node. So that's shift right click both of them, Control P, object, keep transform, and then we want to parent the Turkey control to the root node. So that's shift right click and then Control P. So now, as was said before, the root node controls everything. The Turkey control just controls the armature and the mesh, and then obviously the armature just controls the mesh. So there's a hierarchy of structure there, which is revealed. Let me just double check that. Right, so it's not that one. Yeah, so the structure is root, Turkey root, armature, which is turkey.rig, and then mesh, which is turkey.mesh. And we haven't done anything to the control node, Turkey root, so that will still zoom around and do what it does. But we may need to adjust this because the sequence length has changed to 80 frames. Internet math. What are 3/8? Quickly in chat. 24. Too slow. I was using the calculator anyway, even for that. So we need to adjust the length of the turkey hopping loop, which goes around and round, and that is currently 210 frames. So we want to increase its length. We use the marker or the timeline slider as the pivot point. We select everything and just press the S key and it'll snap to the frames, and we just move this to 280. So the end keyframe, this one, that should reside or end up at frame 280, which is here. So select everything, that's the A key, and then press the S key. And stop when it's in place. left click to confirm. So now we've, whoops, 224, it's 240, isn't it? So it should have been 240, not 280. 240, so rescale that down. There we go, 240. So within 240 frames, the character, which is 80 frames, should jump up and down 3 times. So what we can do now is export this. So let's double check that we've renamed the armature. Yep. Mesh. Yep. Control node. Yep. And root node. And note that root node is always with an uppercase or capital R. So it's capital R, double O, T. It always has to be that way. So let's save this so that we've got a file version to go back to, 31. Needless to say, that there are only 31 versions of this file or this project because of this these videos and explaining what's going on. And obviously doing something like this wouldn't normally take, so this I think is the 8th and possibly final session for this particular character, but it hasn't, so we've done 2 hours per session and this is the 8th video, so that's, you know, 12, 16, you know, a lot of hours. Normally it wouldn't take that long and there wouldn't be this many versions. It's only because we've been going through this and explaining all the bits and pieces individually as it's being done. Yeah, so that is 8. We've done more or less 2 hours per session, so between 12 and 16 hours of this process. But it wouldn't normally take, I mean, you might take, depending on the complexity of the character, obviously, it might take you a couple of hours within a day or two to do something like this, and you wouldn't have as many file versions. But this is obviously only because we've just been explaining everything as we go. So save as, and then we can export this. So we want to select everything, make sure that root is the active element, so that should be the last thing that's selected. That might mean that when you right click it deselects itself, so that's okay. Just shift right click and select it again. File, export, FBX. So here we can keep the file name. We want selected objects, geometries, make sure the use modifiers thing is deselected. As discussed previously, you can, that's optional. Apply modifiers is optional. Armatures, always make sure that add leaf bones is deselected. And in animations, disable NLA strips and force start and end keying. So we just want the all actions, and this will force Blender to write separate action sequences for each of the animations that it finds in the file. So export. Blender will do its thing. And then we go into imvu. So as per usual, create mode. Well, DJ Deb, we still do have the turkey pecking animation, so we can adjust that So what we're doing now is basically testing to make sure that what we've just done imports okay. But once we've done that, we can go back to the pecking animation that we created previously. And you'll see with that in particular how adding these extra bones really helps create a bit more realism with the character. So that's our default scene. So FBX import, so FBX import tab, load FBX, find the file that we created, which is robot Turkey 20, oh no, it's 31, open. So because we've got an armature, we've now increased the number of bones that are included in that. We want the one that says root, which is the root node, corresponding root node of the entire project. So make sure that's selected. Turkey mesh should be shown, which is good. Then configure FBX. That loads all the data that we need. And it's picked up our animation strips, that's okay. It's picked up the materials, good, and the mesh. So rename your mesh or give it the mesh ID of 0 so that it overrides the default chair. Change the scale value 0.01. Leave axes alone as per usual and just import. It'll give us the material overwriting error, which is okay, we want that. And then import changes. And then of course apply changes so everything is seen. So that's the turkey, at least in the scene, without any particular issues. Check the skeleton's being used. Yep, so always make sure you're using the, well, depending on whether you are doing something more complicated than just importing a mesh replacement. So for instance, with what we're doing, make sure the imported armature is used rather than the default chair. Meshes are okay. Yeah, meshes are okay. Materials have all come in. We can set up the vertex painting later, or vertex colors. So we now need to create the actions. So add. Let's just call this move. Keep it simple. Room. Just rotate twice. Otherwise we have to keep resetting the project. Pick the same ensemble, which is this thing, and then in the skeleton ensemble setting, our animation should be here, and we want turkey root. So select that, number of loops 0, want it to replace. So that basically replaces, as the sequence ends, it replaces whatever is supposed to come next in the ensembles. We don't need a loop start or loop end, so that should be okay. Apply, and you can test that just by clicking the play button. And we have our motion around, and it'll do it twice because of the or will it? No, it'll do it infinitely because of the, so this is where it gets a little confusing. So the loops in the ensemble section relates to the animation itself. So the animation sequence at the moment, that is turkey root. So if you set this to 0, it'll loop infinitely. But if you have a number of different ensembles, so you have, let's say, different animations to do with the character pecking at the ground, so 4 different versions, you could set the loops for each of those individual sequences to 1, 3, 5 and 7, and as each plays it'll loop that number of times. So each specific animation will loop X number of times here. Overall, if you want the overall action to loop, you set your loops up here. So what that would do is, setting that to 2, it should loop the ensemble collection, so that's each of the individual animations that you have listed in the ensembles. It'll loop the group twice. So it'll go through, let's say there's one, so it's 0, 1, 2 and 3 for 4 animations. So if you had 2 loops, 4 loops, 6 loops and 8 loops, it'll go through the loops for each one and it'll do it twice. Always found that confusing. So that's what it's doing. So if you put 0 and 0, it'll loop the animation infinitely regardless as to what you've got up in your action up here. So we have to change this just to 2, then reapply, and then just test the animation, and it should just do it twice. So that's once. Oh, and it's still doing it. Unless, well, that's what it should be doing, unless it's just because the play button was used rather than the trigger. Oh, it stopped doing it now. Oh, right, so 2 by 2, that's 4, so it'll loop 4 times. So it's a little, what it should be doing then. Oh, right, okay, yes. So, yeah, right. If you set this to, if you set your ensemble to 1 loop and you set the action loop to 2, it'll loop that twice, because it's doing 2 loops of this 1 loop. So if you set this to 2 and then you do 2 loops up here, it'll loop the actual animation 4 times. So you have to, so if you did your individual sequences at 2, 4, 6 and 8, you'd be doing, what is it, 4, 8, 16 and 24 or whatever it is, the multiples of, depending on what you set up here. But anyway, so that's that sorted out. So we need to add the hop action, do that as 2, pick same ensemble. So we've got our turkey hop, just set that to 1, replace and apply, just check the animation. Yeah, so if you set the loops to 1 and the action to twice, it'll do it twice. So that's the animation that we just created. So what you can do now is adjust whether this plays infinitely or not, depending on what it is that you want it to do. So if you want this to play as soon as a furniture item is loaded, you would use stance.idle. And it'll just automatically play regardless. And it'll play the action sequence. So if you've got your loop set up, it'll automatically play the loops X number of times, depending on what you've got set up here. And it's the same with move. So if we set that to stance.idle as well, that'll auto trigger. So 2 and then 3. But of course you have to you'd have to make sure that you do your math and calculations right, so that if the action is moving around twice, you've got to make sure that the hop animation occurs enough times for it to hop properly around the entire cycle or sequence. And we're done. So let's save this. So FBX Turkey Kate, because Kate is short for Bob. Right, so that works. So what we can do now, select the armature. So we've got the hop animation sequence in play at the moment. So with the armature selected, we've still got the original Bob sequence in place, which is just, I'm just going to detach. What you might find useful is that is to unparent the skeleton or the armature from the Turkey root node. So that's Alt-P. Keep transform. That way the character will stay where it is and it won't move because it's attached to the character control. So with that selected, we've got our Bob. So let's make some adjustments to that. So right, so at that frame, that's where it bobbed. So press the R key, tilt it down, holding control. So we'll snap to the grid. Might be able to do that a bit more. And then tilt its head. And again, we've added a couple of new frame markers, so we'll have to reset a bit of this. So reset that. Reset that, and then reset the legs. And reset the legs. We need to adjust the tail because it's intersected the body. Because it's keeping the old positional data that was, when that was the body, now that it's moved to the tail, the positional data is relative to its new position. So we need to reset that. So that means clearing, so that's Alt-R and it'll reset. Do that for all the frames just so that we've got cleared data. And we can do Alt-G as well just to make sure that there's no positional difference. So when it bobs, the tail should flatten out so that it keeps its balance. As it pecks at the ground. So again, we've kept the old animation sequence and just double checked or cleaned up the positional data that was associated with those old poses. So as we've got the wings, we can probably do something with those. let's drop those. So again, we've added 2 more keyframes, so we have to clear those. Alt R and then Alt R. Always make sure that your front and back first and last frames are exactly the same, and that'll mean that your animation will loop cleanly. So that's it pecking at the ground. So to export this, let's save the file. Save as 32. We need to reparent the armature to the control node. So right click select, shift right click and then control P, object, and double check. So when you move the root, so double check, so we need to do that. So right click the root, everything should move. Right click the character root, that should move, and then the armature, that should move. Excellent. So just save over the file that we just created. Yep. And then export. Obviously it's moving because the control root is moving. But when it's brought into imvu, you wouldn't necessarily set it up so that it uses this. So select all, right click, shift right click the root node to make sure that's the master element, and then export. Export FBX. Oh, main, selected objects, geometries, optional added modifiers, armatures, that's okay, animations, that's okay. So we can save over the top of the file that we just created. And then import again. So we need to create another object, another project. So close that. It's when you're doing this, when you're creating these more complex projects, it's always a good idea to create a new derivable every time you do something significant to the project that you're working on. That way, if you have a problem with the iteration that you're currently importing, you always have the option to go backwards to see what it is that worked and compare that to what isn't working. And it's the same with Blender as it is with imvu. Always save, as best as you can, iterations of the project as you're working on it. So default project, FBX import, load FBX, import the same file again, 31. Yep, make sure that root is selected as a skeleton, Turkey mesh is there, configure FBX. So mesh, change that to 0, apply scale 0.01, axes, leave them alone. So it's brought in the animations, and we can see that the animations contain frame data. Materials are okay, import. Override, that's okay. And then apply changes. So let's go through just creating the peck. Let's just call this Bob. Room, same ensemble. 1, 2. So we want Turkey Bob So we've got turkey bob, turkey hop, turkey hopping, and turkey hopping. So we've got one animation which is associated with two objects, and that's because the animation that's assigned, or this animation, is an object. It's assigned to the root node object, and as it's an object, it tends to, I'm not quite sure if that's a bug or an issue with FBX, but it tends to create a duplicate and assigns that to the armature as an object. We can't use this particular one, but that's one of the reasons I think why there are more than one. There should only be 3 entries here, really, but the node animation is also duplicated to the armature. So we want turkey bob, composition replace, loops to, everything else is okay, apply changes. So we type bob, and there we have the bobbing animation. So with the ensembles, what you could do is create different types of bob or different types of pecking, so the character could twist on its axes as it's pecking at the ground in different positions. And what you would have is, rather than putting all of those in one sequence, the best way to do it within imvu, because of the way that imvu works, is that you split the peck animation into separate animations. So you would have, let's say for the sake of argument, you have a peck of it pecking forward, pecking to the right, pecking to the left. So you'd have 3 separate animation sequences. Load those into the ensembles, and then what you can do is play around with the settings so that imvu randomly selects and plays through the 3 different animations. So you'll introduce an element of randomness to the character, so that it won't necessarily play the sequence through the same way all the time. And the more sub animations that you can add, as in the number of, so it could be it could twist to the right and then peck, or twist to the left and then peck, rather than just pecking to the left and right slightly, or a twist of the head. Each of those would be an animation within the ensemble, and then it would randomly play through each of them to give it a bit more life, basically. And that's what you can do with the ensembles. So that's so that is 8 videos and X number of hours explaining the process of making what is a simple character, texturing it, UV mapping it, vertex groups, rigging, adjusting the rig, sorting out the skeleton, and then animation and import into imvu. And of course we've done different types of import. We've just done an import as just a static mesh that does nothing. We've imported it as a simple animated object, and then what we have now, which is essentially a lot more complicated as an animation sequence. And the whole point really is that you don't necessarily need to do something super complicated from the get-go. So for instance, you could very well have just the mesh parented to the root node, and that would be your item. And you could have a number of these scattered around the scene that are doing nothing, whereas other ones are much more complicated. But you don't necessarily need to set up a complicated rig or skeletal system or control system from the get-go. As we've shown through these videos, is that once you have something, depending on what it is, it can be adjusted after the fact and still work perfectly fine. And that really is probably the big takeaway from this, is that you don't necessarily have to do things overly complicated from the get-go. You can make adjustments as you go along, as you discover new things. You could do with a wind-up key, I guess. That's one thing that you could add. I'm not quite sure where you'd put it though. So yeah, that's the process of animated character rigged up and imported working into imvu. So let's do stance.idle so that it's playing all the time. Let's just put that to infinite, which is 0. And that should play all the time. So then we can double check our vertex painting colors. Remember to set the eyes at self-illuminating so they essentially glow in the dark. And that's the completed character. And obviously it's robotic and repetitive. So when you are doing your animation sequences, you don't necessarily need to do them so robotically. You can introduce, rather than this playing through the bob once, what you could do is, or what would be recommended, is essentially one sequence with it bobbing maybe a couple of times, but you introduce a degree of difference, so it's not bobbing at a regular rate. So it'll do that with this particular animation, but you could do another one where it was bobbing forward maybe 3 times, but the timing or the space between each bob is different, so that it doesn't look quite so repetitive. Because it looks like one of those bobbing, you know, those pen things that you put on the end of a pint glass that bobs into the glass. Yeah, Bob the hopping turkey. So let's save this. Save as FBX turkey Bob file. So, questions. I'm sure there are lots of them. Why is it chat? The chat thing is quicker than video. That's weird. Math. Yeah, very bad at it. Right, so Liana's asking the bones, should they be similar in size to the item it will be controlling? Not necessarily, no. You will find that in situations where you've got bones like these two, well, these three, in fact, you'll find that you'll be locked to the size that you can use because of the relationship or the close proximity each of the bones are to one another. Because the thing or the aspect of it that determines how big the bones are the end points, these pivot points, because they are pivot points. So you can have your bone as big or as small as you want it to, but the crucial element is the node, is the tail, the head and tail nodes, because those determine the pivot point of the individual bone. And then if you've got a string of bones, as we have here, so these three bones, they're all, these two, the leg and the toes, are physically connected. So if I move, if the leg bone is moved, the toe moves with it, because the toe bone is connected to the leg bone. But the leg bone isn't connected to the torso bone. But its size is relative to the torso and the toe because of the two pivot points, the head node and the tail node. Those are the two pivot points. So in a chain of bones, the relationships determine the size. But when the bones are isolated, it doesn't matter. They can be anything, any size you want. So in theory, you could make this absolutely huge. So you do that obviously by adjusting the. So you right-click one of the nodes, tail or head, it doesn't matter. Then just press the G key and move the bone where you want it to be. And then obviously that means that the bone is absolutely huge, which might be a little cumbersome. But these isolated bones can just be about any size that you want. I mean, you could do the same thing with the wings. So make those as big as the wings. So yeah, you can change some of them, but others will be strictly related or restricted to their relationships with other bones. Can you, Frenzy's asking, can you use an empty as a node, as a node box? Well, yes, that's what nodes are. Yes, that's what nodes are. I mean, this is covered in a bit more detail in one of the written tutorials on CatSpits. But these are just empty objects. They're not meshes. Where is it? Empty. Cube. You can use any of these. The cubes are just convenient because they visually they replicate the way that max nodes appear, which are cubes. But once you've got one in place, node data properties, you can set which one it is. Circle, all different types. And depending on what it is that you're using, you might have to change the size of some of them. But a cube is the most obvious. But bearing in mind that the wireframe that you see, which is the pink outline, that's just a visual indicator relative to the object's center point, the origin, which is in the center of the object or center mass of the object, because an empty is literally just an empty object. All it is a set of coordinates in 3D space. So the actual wireframe that you see is just a visual aid to let you know that there is something there. But for furniture, just use the nodes. I mean, you can use bones as per the old Cal 3D system, but for simple items, it's easiest and quickest just to use nodes. And even with more complicated objects, as we've seen with this particular project, this experiment, we can use a combination of nodes to control the overall project. So the root node controls everything, but we're still able to use a skeleton to specifically control the mesh. So that gives us an advantage that for really complicated projects, it might be possible, not tested this, so don't quote me on this, it might be possible to use multiple skeletons parented to, well, the root node, let's say for the sake of argument, and it should create the hierarchy in a way that essentially treats it as, so you'd have the root node, and then you would have the two skeletons would act as sub-elements of the master skeleton or the overall skeleton, which is controlled by root. So what you would have, you'd have another element listed in the outliner, in the same way that you would do if it was any other sort of hierarchical structure, and that should in theory export without any issue. No. Oh no. Not with the armatures and controlled. Frenzy's just asking, when you were done with it, do you then join? No, you don't join anything. The only thing that you join are elements of the mesh that you might have created separately. So let's say, for the sake of argument, the tail that was created as a separate object. Or let's say you created a jetpack as a separate object for export. Depending on what the object was going to do within imvu, you would join the two meshes together. So you would select them in object mode, so they will be outlined pink, or, well, in this theme it's pink, but in the default theme it's orange. They would be outlined, you join them together, that's Control J, or object, join, and then you set up your skeletal control structure to control all the elements that you've joined together. And then it's once you've got your mesh connected and your armature controlling the mesh, what you then do is parent, don't join, I don't think you can actually physically join them, but you want to parent the armature to the control node and then the control node to the root node, and that's Control P, P for Peter, or object, where is it gone? Parent, object, and then you get object keep transform, and that's what you need to do for your empty object or your control skeleton. Yeah, Liana's commenting on DAS 3D, because DAS and Hexagon, you can make structurally complex objects in terms of what you can make with a mesh, but you're limited into, well, severely limited in terms of what you can then do with that mesh. At the moment, you can only export from Hexagon, and it's the same for Paint 3D as well. If you're using those, you can only essentially do a mesh replacement. So that would be the equivalent of starting a new project, and then literally just replacing the chair mesh. So when you bring your FBX in, it'll only bring in mesh data. There'll be no skeletons or any other structure there, so that you would actually be using the default derived items skeleton. So essentially that's all you're doing. That's all you can do with Hexagon, Paint 3D and DAZ at the moment, because it doesn't, they don't recognize the node or null object, which is what nodes are, empties are. So we can't do anything so much with those. Yes, Frenzy, if you, based on the way that you made the product, it will do that. It'll bring in separate meshes, because each of your mesh, your project in Blender is broken into a lot of separate meshes. So it'll when you export that as a project, it'll bring all of them in as separate meshes, which you want to avoid. So you would join all your meshes together unless you were doing something specific that needed that many. And you want to limit the number of meshes that you have anyway, because I think they are hard limited in imvu to 100, I think it is. Yes, so Bryce, Hot Rod's mentioning Bryce. Bryce might be another. I mean, essentially, anything that can export FBX has a chance of being used to create content for imvu. If it can do FBX, you will at the very least be able to do mesh replacement products. So as per what we're looking at on screen with the default chair, if you derive from the chair, you can use the default skeleton that comes with the chair, and essentially all you're doing is just replacing the mesh, and that's it. That should be fine. I mean, the only issues there are making sure that the scaling's correct. Yeah, so, I mean, Blender, Hexagon, DAZ, Paint 3D, Bryce, you know, they're all, I think they're still freely available applications that you have free access to. And the whole idea behind FBX is to try and encourage the use of these, you know, people that might already be used to DAZ or Hexagon or Bryce. The idea is that with FBX, they can at least make some content. It doesn't necessarily need to be complicated, because, as said, they can do mesh replacement products. But yes, if you want to do more complicated things, then you're stuck with, or not stuck with, you would have to use 3D Studio Max if you wanted to be 100% compatible. Blender to be, let's say, 70% compatible at the moment. And then there's Maya, which also does FBX. SketchUp, that's another one. That's another one that predominantly will do mesh replacement, but there are ways around that. But you have to do a bit of fiddling to get that to work. because again, as far as I'm aware, SketchUp doesn't understand null objects either in the same way that Max and Blender does. So that's the stumbling block for all of these applications, isn't so much being able to create meshes, it's being able to create the underlying skeletal structure that's needed. If we can find a way to do that, then more applications can be used, or at least more applications can be used to make more complicated objects. Yeah, so there are Hot Rod's mentioned there's a plugin. I guess it's a plugin or something you can add to SketchUp that will allow you to, presumably this is the licensed version for obviously commercial exploitation, notwithstanding that, it'll allow you to create animated or skeletal structures within SketchUp. Liana, no. Nodes aren't used in all games, but they are useful and can be used. Essentially, it's just a null object. So most content is going to be driven by skeletons. And then nodes or empty objects will be used where a skeletal-like structure or skeletal-like control is needed without the use of an actual skeleton which carries with it various overheads. So they'll use these things called null objects. So that would be a null object could be used to control the position of a door, for instance, or an object that's movable. Oh right, SketchUp versus Maya. Yeah, I'm not 100% with either SketchUp or Maya, so I can't remember which one does what with iClone. Yes, Debs is just saying that there's a lot to, there is, but only really because you're not used to it. Once, I mean, as said, we've done, this is the 8th session going over this Turkey, and 31 iterations of the file, only because we've gone through the process and explained everything. So it appears complicated because obviously there's going to be a huge amount of information and data within that series of videos and the duration that we've been doing this. But once you've understood the principles, when you rewatch the bits and take what you need from it, once you understand the principles, you can assign that to anything. It doesn't matter that we've made a robot turkey. You could apply the same principles to an animated table. So a table that folds or collapses on command, so that when somebody types broken into imvu, the table collapses to the ground. You haven't made a collapsible table. You've just made an object that's controlled by a skeleton. So the same principles apply to skeleton, animation, actions, keyframes, poses, control nodes, meshes. They're all equally applicable to whatever it is that you might think you want to do. So a collapsible table, it's not a collapsible table, it's just a mesh that's affected by a skeletal structure. And so long as you break the process down into its steps and keep in mind the principles, it doesn't matter what it is that you're making. Oh, I wouldn't worry about not thinking. No, thinking getting you into trouble. There's not enough thinking. You need to do more thinking. Even if it's Yeah, Liana, I wouldn't. Liana's just wondering about seeing where else nodes are used. Wouldn't worry about it. It's all we need to know for FBX and imvu is whether they understand nodes. If they don't, then don't worry about it. It just means that you'll be limited in terms of just being able to make mesh products or mesh replacement products. If it doesn't do nodes, if it doesn't understand what a node is, and you can test this by just importing one of the available starter files as an FBX. So if you import an FBX starter file and all you see is a mesh, then you know the nodes, it doesn't understand what nodes are, so don't worry about it. But if you import something and if you import an FBX starter file into DAS 3D, for instance, it'll bring in the mesh and it'll also bring in nodes, but you can't do anything with them. The nodes appear on screen as a similar to this wireframe in Blender, but it's a partial wireframe, but you can't really do much with them. So the infrastructure is there to understand nodes, but the user interface element of it, of allowing users to interface with them and interact with them, doesn't appear to be there, or it's been removed because of obviously the way that DAS is geared towards what DAS does, rather than it being a fully fledged 3D modeling application in the same way that Blender or 3D Studio Max might be. So you can test it. Just import an FBX and see what it does. That would be a quick way of doing it. And if you see something like this, what we're looking at on screen, or something, if you're more familiar with 3D Studio Max, if you see something that looks like that, then you know it might be possible to use the application to make stuff, or make more complicated stuff for imvu. But if it doesn't, and all you're seeing is just a mesh, then you're just going to be restricted to mesh replacements. Yeah, well, it depends, Frenzy. Frenzy's asking, are you going to do anything with these tutorials in the future? There are plans to do other things, but much of them will be related to possibly the contests that imvu run. Because the whole point of those is not so much the contest per se, but it's through FBX it's possible now to, Shannon Mack, that's imvu's community manager, Shannon Mack stepped up to the plate to learn Blender because he wanted to understand the creator process and creators in general. He wanted to understand them better. Because hopefully out of that we might get something from it in terms of getting better access to tools that we might need as creators to make content for imvu. But the schedule that we're using for these Twitch sessions is generally geared around that. Well, it is at the moment, because we do have the Valentine's Valentine's contest going on. But aside from that, the Twitch channel will be used, but there's no set schedule for it. So it's very much impromptu. Oh yes, Hot Rod, SketchUp. Yes, you can import that relatively straightforward into Blender. Again, there's a tutorial on Cat's Bits about it that explains it in great detail. But essentially, as long as you have access to being able to export it to a format that Blender understands, and for the most part that will be Collada DAE or 3ds, FBX obviously, and then a very last resort is Object. The advantage of DAE, 3ds and FBX is obviously that if you're able to, what you can do, I think we went over this in one of the previous sessions, actually, not for the Turkey, but one of the other, with Jinx. If you set up, let's say for the sake of argument, you're creating a room. If you create your room mesh, and then set up your room nodes as small mesh cubes, you can export the whole lot and use the cubes that you've got as positional references that will import into Blender, as DAE or whatever it is, which you can then just essentially do a find and replace. So if you set up something specifically positioned in SketchUp and you want to keep that position, just create a temporary mesh object that you can use as as a proxy for its position, and then just import it as a mesh into Blender, and then just replace it with the appropriate element that needs to be used. So although you can't do particularly sophisticated skeletal structures in SketchUp, you can set up positional proxies as mesh objects, which you can then just replace once you've imported the project into Blender. Yes, Collada DAE. When in the olden days, when SketchUp was Google SketchUp or Google Earth, you had to use the KMZ format. This was before it was bought out by, is it Trimble? I think it is now. But before then, you could use it any way you wanted, really. But you had to export it to KMZ. And KMZ is an archive file. It's essentially a zip file. So you'd have to open that to find the DAE file inside with all your assets. And then once you got that, you could, get it into Blender or another 3D application. But I understand, I haven't used SketchUp for a while, so I don't know if it still does that. Yeah, Trimble. Frenzy DAE Collada should be pretty stable. So if you're having issues with it, just try exporting a very simple project first to make sure that it is exporting and it's exporting what you expect it to, and then work backwards. And that's the only way you can do it. If you're encountering problems with it, you need to figure out where the problems are occurring. So if you can export a simple thing, then you know it's not the format, it's something to do with the project that you're working on. Yeah, DAE can be messy. This is Liana. DAE can be messy, but again, it depends on your project that you're importing and what you're importing, or what you're importing from. I mean, SketchUp files are messy, not because of the format. They're messy in the sense that, to use that word, they're messy because of the way that SketchUp works. You know, the way that SketchUp works within the SketchUp environment. Outside of that, it is very messy, because SketchUp has to translate what it's doing into a usable format, and when it does that, it does a lot of extraneous stuff that you then have to clear out. Yeah, so there you go. So hang on, let me just new window. So furniture item. I guess that's a furniture item or a room, I'm not sure. So what is this, Debs? Oh right, table. Yeah, so this is a furniture item. Yeah, so this is a table with some stools, bar stools, I guess. And I'm going to guess, without looking at the chat, that this center section is a, what do they call it? Well, that's where all your drinks are, and that rises up. Yeah, so yes, so that should be relatively straightforward to export. I mean, depending on how you want this to work, what you might want to do, depending on the texturing, is export. You can export everything in one go, so you're just exporting an entire mesh, but then you have to set up your vertex groups and all that sort of stuff for your seating and skeleton. But for this, yes, you could use nodes. So your seating, let me just view image, see if that works better. That's better. So your seating, you would load this into a blank file and then append this into the furniture starter file. Let me just load that in. Furniture starter file. Right, so yeah. So that's the furniture starter file. So yeah, so all you need to do let me just wriggle the screen a little bit. Oops. Yeah, so all you would need to do for that is, so the mesh essentially replaces the cube. So as a mesh object, it's then parented to the root node, which is currently selected. So you're replacing the green mesh cube and parenting your table to the wireframe. And obviously you've got your stools, so you then use seat nodes, seat node group, for your stool positions. And then depending on what you want to do with the animation, let's say for the sake of argument it is this center section that animates. Let me just double check in the comments. Yeah, so the center will rise when someone sits on a stool. Yeah, so what you would do is actually similar. This is what I mean about the principles. The principles that we use with the turkey are exactly the same for something like this, because we need the root node for the furniture item. That's always needed. So because we want something to happen to this, to the inner section of the table, we need to create a separate node, as we did with the turkey. We need to create a separate node that controls this middle bit of the mesh. Now what you might need to do for that is, or what you can do or could do, is separate this middle bit, separate it from the main body of this mesh, so it's a separate object. It's completely separate. So when you're in object mode, you are right clicking between the two, and that will allow you to use your node to control that specific element. And you should be able to get that set up just using simple nodes. So your motion, your vertical motion, your up and down motion would be relative to you repositioning the node. So let's just hide that for now. So that would be your master node that controls the entire furniture, but you'd also have a second node, and that would control the inner section of the furniture, and you would animate that up and down. So you would create your animated sequence that just has this going up and down. You export the whole thing, and then in imvu you'd set up your action trigger to use it would be stance dot, it'll be stance dot whatever the seating position is. So if you've got 4 seats, if you want it to happen on specific seats, I think it's seat 01 dot idle, seat 02 dot idle. I'd have to double check that. Otherwise you would just do stance dot idle. So or no, it won't be stance dot idle, because that'll load the animation when the furniture item loads. So double check that. But it'll be the trigger that's used as soon as the item sits down, the avatar sits down, and it'll play the sequence. And so that's all you need to do. So again, it's the principles. It's not the specifics. It's the principles that you're looking at. So the furniture item parented to the root node. This center section is controlled by your secondary node, which itself is then animated to do the up and down. And then of course you export to FBX and then reassemble the whole thing and trigger it based on the seating. But yes, how you get that out of SketchUp will depend on how much work you want to do in Blender, basically. It was odd. I think I had to parent the animation node to each. You shouldn't have to do that. It's because basically you're setting up just a standard furniture item. So your seating, your round table seating, so wherever you position the seat group, each of these nodes is parented to the root node. So when the root node of the furniture is moved, the whole lot should move. That's all you need to do. You don't need to do anything odd. I mean, what you might want to do is, because of the position of this pitcher and catcher, if you have those characters on your... If the table is round and you're having the characters sit facing the table, you might want to... Whoops. You might want to adjust the position of the catcher and pitcher node so that they are not inside the table mesh. So for example, let me just do a quick... So if that's your... Just 1, 2, 3, 4. So you're grouping or joining these together, and those are parented to the root node. So if I move this, it now moves everything. But that middle section would be parented to your control node that controls that middle section. Your seating, that's these nodes, that's all parented to the root node, but it's positioned relative to where you want the avatar sitting. And that should be it. 4 of those, or 4 sets of those, all parented to the root node, and that's your skeleton, basically. And then just animate your control node for the center section. And you might have to export that separately, but that should work fine. I mean, in fact, you should be able to export that as an entire object with your central control node animation in place. So it's then just a question of what you use to trigger that animation when somebody sits down on the seat. Debs. As far as I'm aware, parenting can be used in the same way, or an approximation of components in SketchUp. They're obviously not exactly the same thing, but it's about as approximate as you're going to get in a conversion between Blender and SketchUp, or SketchUp to Blender. Alright guys, well we are coming up on, well, we are on 2 hours, so I guess we can call it quits there. We've got our finished turkey, it is animated. I may do some additional animations offline and then upload it to the catalogue and make it derivable. I'll have to see. But next, no guarantees, because it depends how far we get with Shannon Mac. But one of the biggies that a lot of people ask about is poses. So that may be something that we do in another set of streams, but it depends on how far we get with Shannon Mac. Because we were supposed to be adding poses to the Valentine's thing, but I don't know if we will have enough time to get those in place and have a derivable object that people can work from. But, you know, the usual subscribe, follow, blah, 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 etc., etc., if you want to be notified. So yes, until the next, so it'll be Tuesday, session on Tuesday. We might be able to do 3 hours on Tuesday. All right, until Tuesday.